Sounds like Europe. Cross-border podcasting.
Hello and welcome to Sounds like Europe, cross-border podcasting, a project brought to you by WIPA. I am your host, Javi Caminero. The year 2025, which has just begun, will be a year with many important milestones for the WIPA project. The Christmas vacations are now over, we have gathered back our energy, more or less, and I think we are ready to face the many developments of our project. More premieres, the English versions of our podcast, the European Podcast Academy in March. We will talk about all those topics and many more in the following episodes, but for this occasion, I wanted to go back to basics. As you know, I like to chat with podcasters from all over Europe to find out what podcasts are working best in different countries and why. But today, we're going to give it a little twist. Instead of getting to know podcasts from different parts of Europe, we're going to discover Europe through a podcast. I'm talking about The Europeans, a podcast that was launched back in 2017. Since then, in its almost 300 episodes, the hosts of this podcast have analyzed different topics related to Europe and the European Union from a point of view that tries to touch on European politics and culture in an entertaining and accessible way. I feel like Sounds Like Europe was born for episodes like this one. So today, I'm joined by Katy Lee and Dominic Kraemer, hosts and creators of The Europeans. Hello guys, how are you?
Hi, Javi. Oh my God, listening to you saying that, have we really made nearly 300 episodes?
Yeah, I also quite believe that.
And in nearly 8 years as well.
Crazy.
First of all, how are you guys feeling with your podcast? Tell me, what's your story? How was The Europeans born?
Yeah, I think we're feeling pretty happy with where we are at the moment with this podcast. We started it just in our bedrooms, the two of us, 7 years ago, and we started it because we were wondering why there wasn't more pan-European media, why there wasn't more exploring of like what was going on across the borders, what was going on in the European institutions. And we were by no means experts, but we were curious. So yeah, we just decided to start talking about it from our bedrooms, and amazingly, there's an audience for it.
Yeah, I mean, there was some pan-European media available already, but what there was available was very much designed for people who operate within the Brussels bubble. And that's not us, right? Yeah. So I live in Paris, Dominic lives in Amsterdam, and The Europeans is kind of consciously designed as a podcast for people who maybe live in Europe or just are interested in Europe, who are not part of that world and they don't understand all of the obscure vocabulary that sometimes gets used in Brussels. It's very much intended as a podcast where we are guiding you on our own journey to trying to understand what this thing called Europe is in, we hope, a fun way.
You guys are friends. You have known each other for a long time. I think your friendship has had maybe a lot to do with your success and you ultimately deciding to go ahead with this podcast, right?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Katy and I were at university together, and so we've known each other for quite a long time. And I think indeed that friendship, and maybe the fact that Katy is a journalist, but I'm not actually a journalist. I'm an opera singer by training. And I think that kind of also helped mean that we didn't just end up making another political podcast about Europe that spoke to the Brussels bubble and no one else.
Yeah, but we do want it to sound a little bit like two well-informed friends chatting. And we get that a lot when people send us emails. They say, oh, it really feels like I'm eavesdropping on a conversation between two friends. And that's quite important with podcasting. People tend to have quite an intimate relationship with their podcasts in the way that sometimes they don't with radio. You do feel a little bit like you're friends with the hosts, and that's quite a big part of our show and its identity, I think.
And I believe that what makes a podcast unique is that this kind of friendship, this kind of intimacy, even with the listener and within the host, is something you cannot fake. So when you find a podcast that touches on some issues that you're interested on, and it's done by two friends, it's like a comfort zone. Like, okay, I'm gonna give them these 50 minutes of my time so they can explain to me what's happening in Poland, for example. Which were, guys, the main goals of the Europeans when you first started the podcast? I've read on your website, and this is like a big mantra for you. You say that you want to know how the hell the European Union works. Have you figured it out? Or
I don't think anyone ever figures it out.
No, I feel like we're just on the edge after 7 years of being able to know what the difference is between the Council of Europe and the European Council and things like that. It is a complicated beast, but we're trying, week by week to understand it. And that's a really big part of our mission, is making the European Union feel accessible, because it has huge impact on our lives, on all of the people who live in the European Union, like 400 million people. But we don't really talk about it in the same way as we do domestic politics, right? In every country across Europe, you will find media organizations that are primarily focused on national goings-on, which is normal, but also I think needs a little bit of a corrective. And that's where we try and come in. We also were set up partly because, Dominic is a prime example, I hope you don't mind me saying this, of a European who is a bit of a nut about about American politics. And whenever there's a US election, in like super niche terms, what's happening in this county in Georgia? And you really felt, I think, like, why don't you know that about European politics? It was a strange thing.
Yeah. And I guess the answer is partly because it's even more complicated than US politics. Like, it's, as we saw in the European parliamentary elections last year, it's so difficult to work out like what is happening in all these different countries and put it all together into one clear image. So creating these like European narratives is so tricky. But that doesn't mean it's not fun to look at it and really try and pick it apart in a way that is indeed still entertaining and doesn't bore people to death, hopefully.
I think you're doing a great job on accomplishing that goal.
Thank you.
But how do you keep up with everything that's happening in Europe? Because it's a lot. Are there more people, journalists, producers working with you guys, or how does it work?
Yep. So these days we are a team of 4. So there's Dominic in Amsterdam, along with one of our producers, Katz. We also have another producer, Wojciech, living in Poland. And between us, we speak 6 or 7 languages. So we try and keep up with the news of lots of different countries and read the domestic media of lots of different countries, because that's also important. I think if you only read the international news written in English, you miss a lot of stories. So we try as much as possible to keep our eyes and ears everywhere. We are still only a team of 4, though, and we are not everywhere yet. We would like to be, maybe one day. So a lot of the times, great story ideas come from our listeners. We are lucky to have an audience base that is everywhere, and quite often somebody will write in and say, hey, have you heard about this thing going on in Italy, for example? And quite often we haven't. So it's really great that our listeners know that they can do that and are encouraged to do that.
I think I'd add that we don't aim to cover everything, and we are not trying to make a breaking news podcast. So we make a weekly podcast, and often we reflect on an election that happened somewhere 3 or 4 weeks ago when all the mainstream media have stopped talking about it. And we actually think that that's quite an important role that we play in like continuing to talk about stories a bit later on. It's also maybe necessary because we're such a small team that it does just take us longer to cover things. But I also think that has a benefit for the ecosystem, the media ecosystem.
Some of your last episodes, just to give out some examples, you have talked about Donald Tusk's Polish government, the Moldova's election, Georgia's European dream. I think you have managed to create a big community because you use a language that is easy to understand, and you use it to analyze topics that sometimes are not very appealing to a wider audience. So how do you find that balance?
Well, just to let you in on the process a little bit, when I prepare for an episode, I tend to start by reading the news, but then I try to write everything out in the kind of language. Well, first, it's not entirely scripted, the podcast. We do have quite detailed notes because often we are talking about situations where, it's the politics of a country that is not our own. and you got to be damn sure it's accurate. So we do have a lot of notes. But I try and talk on this podcast, and Dominic does too, in a way that feels just like you're talking to a friend in a bar, really. I mean, having a very nerdy discussion maybe in a bar, but a conversation in the bar nonetheless, and just talking like normal people and not trying to sound like newsreaders or anything like that. And I think that's a really important part of what makes our podcasts a little bit more digestible, even when we are dealing with heavy-hitting or complicated topics.
You have also produced, and you are not only making the Europeans weekly show, you have produced some award-winning narrative and investigative podcasts as well. What can you tell us about the Oldly Chronicles, which I personally loved, for one? This Is What a Generation Sounds Like, and Bursting the Bubble. These are the three you have already produced, right?
Yeah, and a few other standalone documentary episodes. We also made one last year about the Klimasignorinnen, this group of older women in Switzerland who took their government to court at the highest European level for not doing enough to protect them against climate change. Making these episodes, making these more narrative podcast episodes is so much more work than making our weekly show, but we find it really important to do this work and to produce this kind of original, highly produced, highly edited, sound designed work every now and again, because the storytelling that you can get over 3 episodes, for example, in that Oatly series that we did, it was an investigation into green capitalism using the Swedish company Oatly as a kind of example. The storytelling you can achieve through a series like that is so much deeper and can really hit people and in a way that our weekly chatter, I guess, only kind of touches the surface, which also is important. But I think we're really happy to have both still.
Mm-hmm. There's also a way for those listeners who want to go deeper in some topics. These narrative investigations are the way for them, I guess. Now you're launching a new investigative series. This is called Who Does It Best? And I wanted you to tell me what's going to talk about, but what is really, I would say, amazing about this project is that it's 100% listener crowdfunding. So they are going to be your producers. How did this idea arrive to you, and how have you finally said, let's go and let's get it?
Yeah, we're really excited about this. So Who Does It Best is going to be a series produced in 2025 about the best policies in Europe. Something that really strikes us again and again while making the Europeans is just how different the approach to different policies can be in different European countries, depending on which country you're in. So, for example, I am a new parent. I have a 14-month-old son. And when I talk to friends in other European countries about their experience of childcare and what is available and how much it costs, it is so different. And you can really see the impact that has on families and also on women getting back to work. Huge, huge difference. So I think it was Dominic had this idea. We were kind of putting our heads together over the summer in Warsaw, thinking about what we want to make next year. And Dominic said, I really think it would be cool to explore this idea of like where actually has the best policy on a specific issue, regardless of, whether it's childcare or whether it's something else. So that's where the idea was born. We're going to be making 3 episodes to start with, and then we'll see if these episodes are popular. Maybe we'll try and fund some more of them. But to start with, we'll be making episodes about housing. So which country has the best policy for dealing with housing, which is so hard, regardless of what country you're in. Drugs policy and how to balance this idea of, personal freedom versus the damage that addiction can do, and childcare. And the reason we decided to crowdfund it is, for a lot of our previous investigative and narrative work, we've had to rely on grant funding, which is often a great way to get projects funded. But the process of getting the grant funding in the first place, you need tens of thousands of euros to make a series like this. And quite often we are unsuccessful in applying for the money. So we were spending loads and loads of time on trying to get the money to make these series. So we thought, why not try a different model of funding it? We are really lucky to have a very engaged, energized audience who care a lot about what we do. The show is mostly funded by our listeners. anyway via patreon.com. So these kind of micro donations and in some case bigger donations. So we thought, why not try something similar with this? We will have a series that is 100% funded by our listeners, and they're going to be the bosses, as you say. So we're quite excited as well about what it's going to mean for us editorially. We really want to feel accountable to our listeners for all of this. So we're going to let them in on the journalistic decision-making process and also our costing, what we're spending their money on. And I think that's a really cool experiment in journalistic accountability.
Yeah, and it's not only their money we're asking for, but we're also asking for their ideas and the policies that they know about in their country. So we've received so many emails and messages already with ideas of policies that we could cover that we probably would never have heard about. So it's really a win-win situation for us that we're able to make this series with their money and also with their ideas.
Yeah, ideas, money, talk about engagement, right? Guys, before we end this episode, I would like to ask you a couple of questions I ask to every guest here at Sounds Like Europe. Let's start with Dominic, for example, and then we'll go with Katy. First of all, Dominic, what's your favorite podcast right now?
That's a really good question.
I can see Katy thinking right now. So
Am I getting the same question?
I think my favorite podcast at the moment is Search Engine, which I'm sorry, Katy, it's like it's her favorite one too.
Damn you!
But it's a podcast from one of the makers of my former favorite podcast, which was called Reply All. He's an American producer called PJ Vogt. PJ Vogt? That's how you pronounce it, don't you, Katy? PJ Vogt. And they cover so many different stories, like vaguely connected to the internet, and they always start with a question. And two of my favorite episodes were this 2-part episode about Berghain, this club in Berlin, about why 2 of his friends didn't get into Berghain, and just starting from the question of like why these 2 guys he knows didn't get into Berghain, they managed to create a 2-part podcast mini-series involving Berlin public policy and like the history of this incredible club. It was really impressive.
It is.
What
great.
about you, Katy?
Well, since Dominic stole my recommendation, rude. I'm going to give you a French podcast. I've been listening, I dip in and out of it, but a podcast called Transfert, which I love a lot. And these are just very intimate first-person narrated stories. It's a kind of story, the kind of podcast that you can just lose yourself in. It is just one person's voice telling you a story about something that's happened in their life. I mean, I guess presumably they're interviewed in like a normal classic way and then they cut out all of the questions, but they do it in a really clever way that makes it feel like you're just listening, maybe overhearing somebody tell a really interesting story on the bus, and then you just like don't want to leave the bus because you have to hear the end of the story. And I love it. You know, we're talking about the intimacy of podcasts, and this is one of those things. Sometimes they're big stories from people's lives. Sometimes they're stories about little moments, and they're just often really moving and beautiful and stay with me for a long time.
And yes, to go to the last question of this interview, guys, let's start with Dominic again. This is easier, okay? What's your favorite moment to listen to podcasts?
Ooh, well, actually, I'm one of these weird nighttime listeners. I go to sleep listening to podcasts.
Just a few.
And actually, honestly, I have a completely different category of podcasts I listen to when I'm going to sleep. I generally only listen to film and TV podcasts when going to sleep because that's one of the few things that isn't going to disturb me enough to keep me awake. But I love it. It's my favorite. One of my favorite times of the day is going to sleep and listening to some people chatting in my ears.
And Katy?
Well, for me, I have a bit of a weird routine at the moment where on my way to creche, when I'm pushing my son in his pushchair to creche, I listen to my very serious German audiobook about East German history. But on the way back, I get to listen to a treat, which is a podcast. So I feel like I split my time equally at the moment between like...
It's variety.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, yay, the journey home. I get to listen to something fun. So that's my
You're so disciplined. I'm really impressed, Katy.
It's not going to last. I don't always do it. Sometimes I'm like, I can't do it today. No more East German history. I'm sorry.
Well, Katy Lee and Dominic Kraemer, hosts and creators of the Europeans, thank you guys for joining me in this episode of Sounds Like Europe. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks
so
so
much,
much,
Javi.
Javi.
And to everyone listening to this interview, please check out the Europeans because they do a job that I'm sure will fascinate you if you like Sounds Like Europe. Every Thursday, they release a new episode, so you know what to do. And stay tuned to their socials, at Europeans Podcast on Instagram and at Europeans Pod on X, so you can find all the details about their new series, Who Does It Best. I've been your host, Javi Caminero, and I will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode of Sounds Like Europe. Adios.
Sounds Like Europe, cross-border podcasting is a WePod podcast funded by the Creative Europe programme. Hosted and written by Javi Caminero, sound design by Manu Tomillo, coordinator Alexander Damiano Ricci, executive producer Anna Ribera.